The house built for power that never expected to end. Power always believes it has time. Enough time to carve itself into stone. Enough time to turn wealth into permanence, and permanence into destiny. Linwood Hall was built on that belief not as a home, but as proof that American power had finally learned how to last forever. There are buildings designed to be lived in. There are buildings designed to be admired. And then there are buildings designed to outlive the people who built them. Linwood Hall belongs to the last category. Hidden in the quiet suburb of Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, far from the ceremonial avenues of Washington and the financial canyons of New York, Linwood Hall was never meant to be merely a residence. From its first stone, it was conceived as a declaration, a physical statement that power, once achieved, could be made permanent through architecture. When Linwood Hall was completed at the dawn of the 20th century, the United States was still learning how to understand its own wealth. The country had no ancient aristocracy, no inherited castles, no medieval ruins to legitimize hierarchy. What it had instead was speed, industrial speed, financial speed, expansion without historical restraint. Fortunes were not accumulated over centuries, they were seized in decades. And those who seized them faced a problem no balance sheet could solve: how to make new power look inevitable, rightful, and eternal. Architecture became the answer. The Gilded Age was not merely an era of excess. It was an era of anxiety. Beneath the marble staircases and imported tapestries lay a quiet fear that power acquired too quickly could disappear just as fast. To guard against that fear, America's financial elite built monuments to permanence. Not monuments for the public, but monuments for themselves. At the center of this impulse stood Peter Arrell Brown Widener. Widener was not a man of spectacle. He did not chase headlines, nor did he cultivate a public persona. His power was structural, embedded in railroads, banking networks, and corporate alliances that shaped the economic skeleton of the nation. As a close associate of J.P. Morgan, Widener operated in a world where decisions were made quietly, consequences rippled globally, and visibility was a liability rather than an asset. Linwood Hall was the physical extension of that worldview. Widener did not want a palace that dazzled. He wanted a house that commanded. A house that communicated order, hierarchy, and inevitability without ever raising its voice. To achieve this, he turned to one of the most influential architects of the American elite, Horace Trumbauer. Trumbauer understood something crucial about American power at the turn of the century. Unlike European aristocracy, which relied on bloodlines and tradition, American elites needed symbols that created legitimacy rather than inherited it. Classical architecture, symmetrical, disciplined, and rooted in Western ideals of civilization, became the chosen language. Linwood Hall was designed in the neoclassical tradition, not as imitation, but as assertion. Its proportions echoed English country estates. Its materials signaled durability, and its layout enforced distance. With more than 110 rooms, massive limestone walls, and interiors clad in marble and rare woods, the house was built to slow time itself. Every corridor extended perspective. Every ceiling elevated silence. Every room reminded the visitor that they were standing inside a system larger than themselves. This was not luxury for comfort. This was luxury for control. Inside Linwood Hall once hung one of the most important private art collections in the United States. Paintings by Rembrandt, Raphael, Titian, not displayed for admiration, but for alignment. By surrounding himself with the cultural artifacts of old Europe, Widener was not indulging taste. He was anchoring his power to the deepest roots of Western civilization, declaring that American wealth was no longer provincial, it had arrived as an equal. But history is merciless toward assumptions of permanence. In 1912, the illusion cracked. Widener's son, George Dunton Widener, perished aboard the Titanic, a ship itself designed as a floating monument to modern confidence and technological supremacy. The parallel was brutal and symbolic. A family that believed in engineered permanence lost its heir to one of history's most infamous demonstrations of human overconfidence. From that moment on, Linwood Hall changed not physically, but spiritually. What had been built as a fortress against time became a silent witness to its advance. The house remained standing, immaculate and vast, yet increasingly detached from the world it was meant to dominate. Power began to move elsewhere into corporations without walls, institutions without faces, systems without monuments. The Widener fortune endured. The Widener name survived. But Linwood Hall began its long descent into irrelevance, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well at representing a kind of power America no longer needed to see. The tragedy of Linwood Hall is not abandonment. It is obsolescence. And that obsolescence tells us something unsettling, that even the most carefully constructed symbols of authority are temporary, and that architecture, no matter how monumental, cannot freeze history in place. Linwood Hall still stands today not as a ruin, but as a question carved in stone. What happens to power when it no longer needs to be seen? Inheritance without an heir. Power does not collapse when it loses money. It collapses when it loses continuity. When inheritance breaks, architecture becomes excess and monuments become liabilities. After the Titanic sank, Linwood Hall did not lose its owner. It lost its future. Power does not vanish all at once. It retreats. It withdraws from rooms, from rituals, from spaces built to contain it. And when it does, what remains is not collapse, but emptiness, the most unsettling condition a monument can endure. After 1912, after the Atlantic swallowed both steel and certainty, Linwood Hall entered a different phase of existence. The house did not close its doors. It did not fall silent overnight. Instead, it continued to function. Precisely as designed, only now, its purpose had evaporated. The loss of George Widener was more than a family tragedy. It was a structural failure in the logic that had justified Linwood Hall's existence. The house had been built around the assumption of continuity, father to son, fortune to heir, power to legacy. When that chain broke, the building was left performing a role for which the audience had quietly disappeared. In the years that followed, America itself began to change faster than its monuments could adapt. The First World War accelerated a transformation already underway. Industrial power centralized. Financial influence migrated into institutions rather than individuals. Decision-making moved behind closed doors that required no marble staircases, no grand halls, no visible symbols of dominance. Power became abstract, procedural, mobile. It learned how to travel without luggage. Linwood Hall, by contrast, could not move. Its walls were too thick, its rooms too formal, its logic too dependent on hierarchy and presence. The rituals that once animated its spaces, formal dinners, controlled access, deliberate social choreography, began to feel anachronistic in a world defined by speed, efficiency, and mass coordination. The house remained perfectly intact, yet increasingly out of sync with the era unfolding around it. This is the paradox that defines many monuments of elite power. They are constructed to resist time. But in doing so, they resist change. And resistance to change, in a society that reinvents itself aggressively, becomes a form of vulnerability. By the 1920s, Linwood Hall was no longer essential to the family's operations. It had become symbolic rather than functional. A place visited out of obligation rather than necessity. Maintained, but no longer inhabited with intent. Its rooms were preserved not because they were needed, but because letting them decay would have felt like an admission and acknowledgement that permanence had been an illusion. Yet even maintenance has limits when meaning disappears. As decades passed, the gravitational center of American power drifted decisively away from private estates. Corporate headquarters rose in cities. Regulatory bodies expanded. Influence was exercised through policy, capital flows, and global networks rather than through proximity and pedigree. The visible architecture of authority gave way to invisible systems. Linwood Hall became a relic of a previous operating system. It was not that the Widener family lost power. They did not. Wealth remained. Influence persisted. What vanished was the need for a building like this, a structure designed to impress through mass, silence, and spatial dominance. The house waited. It waited through economic booms and collapses. Through the Great Depression, when its very existence stood in sharp contrast to national hardship. Through the Second World War, when authority was mobilized through governments and militaries, not dining rooms and galleries. Waiting, however, is not neutral. Waiting accelerates decay. Without constant human presence, the rhythms of the house slowed. Rooms were used less frequently. Staff was reduced. The choreography that once justified the scale of the building dissolved. What had been an ecosystem of power became an oversized container with no clear contents. And here, the deeper truth of Linwood Hall reveals itself. The house was never abandoned because it failed. It was abandoned because it worked too well for a world that no longer existed. It embodied a model of power rooted in visibility, permanence, and inheritance. When that model expired, the building lost its relevance overnight, despite remaining physically flawless. This is the cruel efficiency of modern history. It does not destroy what it outgrows. It simply leaves it behind. By the mid-20th century, Linwood Hall stood at a crossroads without realizing it. It could no longer function as a private seat of power. But it had not yet been redefined. It existed in suspension, neither alive nor dead, neither celebrated nor condemned. A house without a future, still burdened by its past. And in that suspended state, it became vulnerable not to ruin, but to repurposing, a word that would soon test how far a monument to elite authority could be stripped of its original meaning. That test would come next, when power is repurposed. There is nothing more dangerous to a monument of authority than usefulness. The moment power is forced to justify itself, its illusion begins to drain away. When Linwood Hall was converted into an institution, it did not find a new purpose. It exposed the limits of the one it was built for. Power does not always end in collapse. Sometimes it ends in conversion. By the middle of the 20th century, the question surrounding Linwood Hall was no longer whether it could continue as a private estate. That answer had already arrived. Quietly and without ceremony. The real question had become something more unsettling. What happens when a structure built to embody elite authority is handed over to an institution that never asked for that authority in the first place? In 1952, Linwood Hall passed into the care of Faith Theological Seminary. On paper, the transfer appeared rational, even hopeful. A massive, underused estate would find new life as an educational institution. Dormitories would replace guest suites. Lecture halls would replace drawing rooms. Purpose, at last, would return. But architecture is not neutral. Buildings remember why they were built, even when humans attempt to overwrite that memory. Linwood Hall had not been designed for education, community, or accessibility. It had been designed for separation, for controlled movement, formal distance, and the careful management of presence. Its corridors were too long. Its rooms too imposing. Its scale too authoritarian for the rhythms of daily institutional life. Students walked through spaces never meant for learning. Classrooms occupied rooms designed to intimidate. The weight of stone and silence pressed down on activities that demanded flexibility, conversation, and adaptation. What had once amplified authority now distorted purpose. The seminary did not fail because it lacked conviction or discipline. It struggled because it was trying to inhabit a structure that resisted being reinterpreted. The building absorbed resources at a relentless pace. Maintenance costs escalated. Heating, roofing, plumbing systems built for aristocratic abundance proved incompatible with institutional austerity. The house demanded reverence. The institution required utility. That mismatch proved fatal. By 1968, the seminary withdrew. And with that departure, Linwood Hall crossed an invisible threshold. It ceased to be repurposed. It ceased to be used. For the first time since its construction, It entered a condition that architecture is least equipped to survive irrelevance. This was not abandonment driven by crisis. There was no war, no natural disaster, no economic collapse forcing the doors shut. The building was left behind in a nation that was prosperous, expanding, and fully capable of action. Its neglect was not accidental. It was chosen not explicitly, but collectively, through indecision and deferral. From that point forward, Linwood Hall existed without function. And without function, meaning begins to erode faster than stone. Ownership changed hands. Proposals appeared and vanished. Developers imagined hotels, conference centers, luxury residences. Each plan collided with the same reality. The cost of restoring a monument built for absolute power far exceeded the value it could produce. In a world that no longer needed such monuments, the house became too expensive to save and too important to destroy. That is the most dangerous state a building can occupy. With no occupants and no mandate, Linwood Hall began its slow transformation into something else, not a ruin in the classical sense, but a static relic, suspended between preservation and erasure. Weather entered where people once controlled access. Water replaced ceremony. Silence replaced authority. And yet, the structure remained defiant. Its walls did not crumble easily. Its proportions refused collapse. It decayed slowly, stubbornly, as if insisting that forgetting it would take as much effort as remembering. This period marks a turning point in the story of Linwood Hall. No longer a seat of power. No longer a failed institution. It became something far more uncomfortable, a visible reminder of how completely power can outgrow its own symbols. America did not demolish Linwood Hall, because doing so would have required admitting that an entire philosophy of authority had expired. Instead, it allowed the building to remain present enough to be noticed, neglected enough to be dismissed. From this moment on, Linwood Hall would no longer speak for those who built it. It would speak against them. Abandonment as a decision. Buildings are rarely abandoned by accident. They are abandoned by delay. By hesitation disguised as responsibility. By the quiet agreement that doing nothing is easier than deciding what the past is worth. This is how Linwood Hall was left behind deliberately, without ever being condemned. Abandonment is often described as neglect, as if it were an accident. But abandonment is rarely accidental. It is a decision made slowly, collectively, and without signatures. By the late 20th century, Linwood Hall had crossed from vacancy into something more permanent. No longer waiting to be reused, it had begun to wait to be forgotten. The distinction matters. Vacant buildings anticipate return. Forgotten buildings do not. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but a long administrative silence. No emergency orders. No demolition hearings. No decisive restoration campaigns. Instead, there was the steady hum of inaction. Insurance policies adjusted. Security reduced, inspections delayed. Each small deferral compounded the last, until time itself became the primary actor. Weather entered the building the way power once had, gradually, confidently, and without opposition. Water traced the logic of gravity through ceilings designed to impress. Freeze and thaw worked patiently on limestone chosen for its permanence. Vegetation found purchase where human attention had withdrawn. These were not catastrophes. They were processes irreversible precisely because they were ordinary. During these years, Linwood Hall acquired a new audience. Photographers arrived first, drawn by the scale of decay and the austere beauty of rooms stripped of function. Their images circulated quietly, then widely. What had once been private authority became public spectacle, reframed through the aesthetics of ruin. The house was no longer a command, it was a question. That question reached institutions tasked with preservation, and the response revealed the deeper tension at the heart of American memory. Organizations such as Preservation Pennsylvania flagged Linwood Hall as critically endangered, emphasizing its architectural integrity and rarity. Their reports were clinical, precise, and urgent. But urgency alone does not mobilize resources when meaning is contested. Because Linwood Hall did not fail quietly, it failed visibly. And visible failure of elite symbols creates discomfort. To restore it would require more than money. It would require a narrative capable of justifying why a monument to concentrated private power deserved public concern. That narrative never stabilized. Opposition was rarely explicit. It took the form of questions asked in budget meetings and editorials. Why save this? Who benefits? What story would restoration tell and about whom? These questions did not need answers to be effective. Their repetition was enough to stall action. Thus, abandonment became policy without being named as such. In this limbo, Linwood Hall transformed again, this time into a mirror. It reflected not the ambition of its builders, but the ambivalence of the society that inherited it. A society adept at celebrating innovation, struggled to confront the residue of old hierarchies. It found it easier to let stone decay than to articulate a coherent relationship to the power that stone once served. Meanwhile, the building continued its slow descent. Not into rubble, but into ambiguity. Each year of exposure raised restoration costs. Each year of delay narrowed the range of plausible futures. The logic was self-reinforcing. The longer nothing happened, the more impossible action became. This is the quiet brutality of modern decline. No villains. No singular failure. Just the cumulative effect of choosing later over now. By the time the public began to ask whether Linwood Hall could still be saved, the question had already shifted. It was no longer should it be saved, but what does it mean if it isn't? The house had ceased to be an object of intervention, and become a symbol of hesitation, a testament to how power leaves behind structures too heavy to carry forward and too uncomfortable to discard. Abandonment, in this sense, was not the end of Linwood Hall's story. It was its most revealing chapter. A chapter that showed how authority dissolves not in moments of crisis, but in the long intervals where responsibility is endlessly deferred. And once abandonment settles in, it does not simply remove people from buildings. It removes certainty from history, the economics of hope. When preservation fails, hope becomes a business. Not hope meant to act, but hope meant to wait. Linwood Hall became valuable not because it could be saved, but because no one could afford to decide what saving it would mean. When preservation fails, speculation arrives. By the turn of the 21st century, Linwood Hall had become something paradoxical. A property of immense symbolic value and minimal practical use. It was no longer sustained by heritage, nor condemned by policy. Instead, it drifted into a different market, altogether the market of possibility. Not possibility as action, but possibility as narrative. Developers came with visions before they came with capital. Concept drawings circulated showing luxury hotels, carved into neoclassical symmetry. Conference centers hidden behind restored facades. Elite residences marketed as living history. These proposals spoke fluently in the language of revival. They promised rebirth without reckoning, restoration without confrontation. And for a moment, they worked on paper. But Linwood Hall had reached a stage where paper could no longer protect it from reality. Engineering reports told a harsher story. Roof systems compromised beyond cosmetic repair. Structural elements weakened by decades of moisture intrusion. Mechanical infrastructure effectively non-existent by modern standards. To restore the house was not to renovate it, was to rebuild while pretending not to. The cost estimates climbed into figures that defied rational investment, especially when weighed against returns constrained by zoning, preservation requirements, and market demand. Hope, however, is not bound by spreadsheets. What followed was a cycle that repeated with quiet regularity. A new owner acquired the property at a price that reflected decay rather than grandeur. Press statements followed, heavy with optimism and light on specifics. Local headlines spoke of renewed interest. Preservationists allowed themselves cautious belief. And then silence. Plans stalled. Financing evaporated. Ownership shifted again. Each iteration left the building worse off than before. Speculation, unlike preservation, does not require maintenance. It thrives on delay. As long as a future can be imagined, the present can be neglected. Linwood Hall became valuable precisely because it could not be resolved. It functioned as a placeholder for ambition, a canvas onto which visions could be projected without ever being realized. This is the cruel irony of speculative heritage. The more impossible a site becomes, the more alluring it appears to those who believe they can be the exception. Local authorities found themselves trapped between competing pressures. Demolition was politically radioactive. Restoration was financially unrealistic. Enforcement risked legal entanglements with owners who promised action but delivered postponement. The result was paralysis disguised as patience. Meanwhile, the building continued to deteriorate. Indifferent to press cycles and proposals. Every winter widened fractures. Every storm tested limits already exceeded. The cost of intervention rose not incrementally, but exponentially. What had once been a question of funding became a question of viability. And yet, Linwood Hall's symbolic power only intensified. It became a case study in conferences on urban decay and elite architecture. It appeared in documentaries and long-form journalism as shorthand for American excess left unresolved. The house no longer needed to be seen in person to exert influence. Its image, empty halls, collapsed ceilings, light spilling through broken roofs, circulated as evidence of something larger, the inability of modern systems to responsibly inherit the monuments of private power. Speculation promised resurrection. In practice, it extended the waiting. This waiting revealed a deeper truth about how societies manage uncomfortable legacies. When direct confrontation is too costly financially, politically, morally, delay becomes strategy. The future is invoked not to arrive, but to justify inaction in the present. Linwood Hall thus entered its most abstract phase. No longer defined by function or ownership, it existed as an idea suspended between profit and principle. A site everyone referenced, few understood, and no one resolved. And as hope was repeatedly monetized and deferred, the house approached a final threshold, where the question was no longer whether it could be saved, but whether its continued existence served a purpose at all. That reckoning would not come through investors or institutions. When ownership ends and memory begins, there comes a moment when deeds stop mattering. When ownership dissolves, and history takes possession instead. Linwood Hall crossed that threshold quietly, the moment it stopped being real estate, and became evidence. There comes a moment in the life of every monument when ownership becomes irrelevant. Titles may still exist. Deeds may still be filed. But authority over meaning quietly transfers from individuals to memory, from private hands to collective judgment. Linwood Hall crossed that threshold not through legislation or ceremony, but through exhaustion. By the early 21st century, the house was no longer discussed primarily as real estate. It was discussed as evidence. Evidence of a system that built at a scale it could not ethically or practically sustain. Evidence of wealth that believed permanence could be engineered. Evidence of a society unsure how to inherit what it did not choose. Public perception hardened slowly. Articles no longer asked what could be done, they asked what this meant. The tone shifted from optimism to diagnosis. Linwood Hall became shorthand, a visual argument in debates about inequality, excess, and the long shadows cast by private power. Its decay was no longer a failure to be solved. It was a condition to be interpreted. This transition mattered. Because once a building becomes symbolic, intervention changes meaning. Restoration risks erasure of the lesson. Demolition risks denial of the past. Inaction, too, becomes a statement, one that suggests discomfort without resolution. Photographs circulating online did what decades of reports could not. They collapsed distance. Empty halls, fractured ceilings, daylight cutting through stone. These images invited the public into spaces once designed to exclude them. The architecture of authority, stripped of control, became accessible only in ruin. And in that accessibility, a reversal occurred. The building no longer spoke downward. It spoke back. Scholars began to frame Linwood Hall as a case of unresolved heritage, a site whose value lies precisely in its refusal to be neatly categorized. Not a museum. Not a ruin preserved for tourism. Not a property awaiting rebirth. But a standing contradiction. A place where ambition met time and lost slowly, expensively, and without spectacle. In this framing, the house's deterioration was not merely physical. It was narrative. Each fallen beam and water-stained wall undercut the original promise of inevitability. The building had been constructed to project continuity. What it now projected was fragility. Importantly, this shift did not require consensus. Some saw Linwood Hall as a cautionary tale about unchecked wealth. Others saw it as an irreplaceable architectural loss. Many saw it simply as a haunting image. Together, these readings formed a mosaic of meaning that no single owner could control. This is the moment when history takes possession. History does not preserve kindly. It preserves honestly. It allows contradiction to stand. And in allowing Linwood Hall to remain unresolved, history preserved something more valuable than a restored facade. It preserved the tension between power and responsibility. The house, in its silence, began to teach. It taught that power seeks solidity but operates in motion. That monuments built for dominance age faster than systems built for adaptation. That inheritance without relevance becomes burden. And that memory, once activated, does not require permission. By the end of this phase, Linwood Hall no longer belonged to developers, institutions, or even preservationists. It belonged to discourse. To classrooms and essays, to documentaries and arguments. To the uncomfortable space where a nation confronts what it built when it believed itself unstoppable. Ownership had ended. Meaning had begun. Why some monuments are saved. History does not preserve what was most powerful. It preserves what can be explained without disturbing the present. Some estates learned how to tell a comforting story. Linwood Hall refused and was left to stand alone. To understand why Linwood Hall remains unresolved, it must be placed beside the monuments that survived. History does not preserve at random. It selects. And the criteria of that selection are rarely architectural alone. They are moral, economic, and narrative decisions shaped by what a society finds useful to remember. Across the United States, other estates born of the same Gilded Age followed different trajectories. In North Carolina, Biltmore Estate was transformed into a carefully curated experience. Its scale was reframed as achievement. Its excess contextualized as craftsmanship. Its inequality softened through education and tourism. Biltmore survived not because it was smaller or cheaper, but because it could be repackaged. It could tell a story the present was willing to host. In Newport, Rhode Island, the summer cottages of the American elite were folded into a broader civic narrative. They became museums, event spaces, classrooms, institutions that absorbed their grandeur and redirected it toward public consumption. Their survival depended on a crucial adaptation. They learned how to explain themselves. Linwood Hall never did. Its architecture resists narration. Its scale overwhelms interpretation. There is no easy entry point, no softened path from admiration to critique. The house offers no comfortable moral framing. It does not invite celebration, and it does not neatly accept condemnation. It stands mute, refusing to tell visitors what they should feel. This refusal matters. Monuments that survive usually perform a service. They educate, entertain, or inspire. They offer clarity. Linwood Hall offers ambiguity. It does not resolve the contradiction between wealth and responsibility, it exposes it. And exposure is far harder to institutionalize than inspiration. There is also a practical truth beneath the symbolism. Preservation requires coalitions. It requires alignment between money, policy, and meaning. Linwood Hall never achieved that alignment. Its cost exceeded its narrative utility. Its story resisted simplification. Its location offered limited economic incentive. Each factor alone was manageable. Together, they proved decisive. But the deeper reason Linwood Hall was left behind lies elsewhere. It represents a kind of power that modern America prefers not to foreground: private, inherited, insulated, and unapologetically hierarchical. Unlike industrial museums or civic landmarks, it does not map cleanly onto progress. It does not illustrate innovation or democratic expansion. It illustrates control, and control is uncomfortable to commemorate. Thus, while other estates were absorbed into the national memory as artifacts, Linwood Hall remained outside the frame. Not erased, but excluded. Not destroyed, but isolated. It became an outlier not because it mattered less, but because it mattered in the wrong way. In this sense, Linwood Hall reveals the hidden logic of historical survival. What endures is not what was most powerful, but what can be made acceptable. What is preserved is not what was most honest, but what can be explained without destabilizing the present. Linwood Hall could not be domesticated. So it was left to age. And in aging alone, it assumed a role no preserved monument can fully claim. It became a control case, a reminder of what happens when power builds without an exit strategy, when permanence is assumed rather than earned. This is why Linwood Hall still unsettles. It stands as proof that preservation is not merely an act of care, but an act of choice, and that every choice reveals values. In choosing not to save it, America did not reject its past. It revealed which parts of that past it was unwilling to carry forward. The house remains, not as a failure of preservation, but as a limit of narration. And limits, once exposed, are impossible to ignore. When power withdraws, power never announces its exit. It simply stops needing witnesses. What remains are structures built for attention, abandoned by a system that learned how to rule without being seen. Linwood Hall is what visibility leaves behind. History rarely announces its conclusions. It allows them to settle. By the time Linwood Hall reached its present condition, there was no single moment of failure left to identify. No vote sealed its fate. No decree condemned it. What remained was something far more revealing than catastrophe: a long silence, uninterrupted and unrescued, in which meaning detached itself from ownership and drifted into memory. This is where the story of Linwood Hall truly ends, not with collapse, but with exposure. The building was designed to answer a question its builders believed settled forever. What does American power look like when it has arrived? Stone answered. Scale answered. Symmetry answered. For a time, the answers were convincing. They held dinners, hosted alliances, absorbed art and influence, and projected the confidence of a class that mistook momentum for destiny. But power does not remain where it is displayed. It migrates to where it is most efficient. As the 20th century advanced, authority learned to travel light. It left behind the rituals that required rooms and corridors. It exchanged architecture for infrastructure, presence for process, visibility for leverage. In doing so, it rendered its old containers obsolete, not by attacking them, but by ignoring them. Linwood Hall did not fall because power was defeated. It fell because power no longer needed witnesses. What remains, then, is not a ruin in the romantic sense. It is a record. A material archive of assumptions once held with certainty. That wealth could secure permanence, that hierarchy could be stabilized by stone, that inheritance could guarantee relevance. Each assumption is still legible in the building's proportions, now contradicted by time. In its current state, Linwood Hall performs a function no restored monument can. It does not reassure, it does not inspire, it does not reconcile the past with the present. Instead, it holds tension. It refuses closure. It stands as an unresolved sentence in the national narrative, unfinished, uncomfortable, and therefore instructive. This is why attempts to save it often falter at the level of meaning, rather than money. Restoration would require a story capable of absorbing the building's original intent without sanitizing it. Demolition would require admitting that an entire chapter of private authority has no place left to stand. In between, the house remains neither forgiven nor erased. And perhaps that is the point. Some structures survive not to be celebrated, but to remind. Not to be used, but to be reckoned with. Linwood Hall reminds us that power leaves behind artifacts, even after it departs, and that the hardest inheritance is not wealth, but consequence. If the building disappears tomorrow, history will not be simplified. If it endures another century, history will not be resolved. The outcome matters less than the question it continues to pose, silently and without appeal. What does a society do with the physical remains of authority it no longer recognizes but cannot deny? In the end, Linwood Hall does not ask to be saved. It asks to be understood. And in that demand unvoiced, unyielding, it becomes something its builders never intended, not a monument to power, but a measure of it. Power does not die when buildings fall silent. It lingers as pressure, as memory, as unfinished reckoning. Long after authority leaves, its architecture remains to ask the question power never answers. What do you do with what you built when you believed you would last? Power does not end when its structures collapse. It enters an afterlife. Long after authority withdraws from rooms and corridors, long after decisions stop being made beneath chandeliers and carved ceilings, power continues to exist as memory pressure, a force that shapes how the past is interpreted and how the future is imagined. This is the final condition of Linwood Hall. In its current state, the building no longer functions as architecture. It functions as residue. What remains standing is not merely stone and steel, but the outline of a mindset, a belief that scale could substitute for legitimacy, that silence could enforce obedience, that permanence could be engineered. These beliefs did not vanish with the departure of the Widener family or the failure of redevelopment plans. They migrated into corporate campuses without ornament, into financial systems without addresses, into power structures that learned from the mistakes of visibility. Linwood Hall is what visibility leaves behind. Its emptiness is instructive. The absence of people reveals how completely the building depended on hierarchy to make sense. Without servants, guests, and controlled movement, its spaces lose coherence. The Grand Hall no longer leads anywhere. The corridors no longer manage access. The architecture collapses inward, conceptually, even when the walls still stand. This is the fate of power once its performance ends. In many cultures, ruins are romanticized. They are framed as beautiful remnants of fallen empires, softened by time and distance. Linwood Hall resists that framing. It is too recent, too familiar, too American. Its decay does not feel ancient, it feels unresolved. It does not belong to myth. It belongs to accountability. That is why it unsettles. Unlike medieval castles or classical temples, Linwood Hall has no narrative of conquest or divine order to absorb its decline. It was built in a republic that claimed mobility, merit, and progress. Its existence contradicts those ideals, and its abandonment exposes the contradiction rather than resolving it. The building survives not because it is protected, but because no one has yet decided what its disappearance would mean. This hesitation reveals something fundamental about modern power. True authority no longer requires monuments. In fact, monuments can become liabilities too visible, too interpretable, too slow. Contemporary power prefers abstraction. It prefers contracts, algorithms, institutions, and processes that leave no ruins behind. Linwood Hall is the opposite of that preference. It is heavy with implication. It demands interpretation. It refuses to disappear quietly. And so it remains standing not as a warning issued deliberately, but as one issued accidentally. A reminder that every system of power produces physical traces, even when it believes it has transcended them. A reminder that the past does not ask permission to linger. In the end, Linwood Hall does not belong to architecture, preservation, or even history alone. It belongs to a larger category: evidence. Evidence that power once believed itself stable enough to be carved into stone. Evidence that it was wrong. What comes after power is not emptiness. It is reckoning. And reckoning, unlike authority, cannot be designed.